Hi everyone, welcome to lecture guide number 3, which is about photography and art, pictorialism and traditions of painting. Pictorialism is a term that was applied to photography that aspired to be art from the mid to the end of the 19th century and a little bit beyond that. We'll pick this story up a little bit more next week when we look at the work of Alfred Stieglitz and camera work and some of the photographers that he championed as well. But we're going to start this lecture by talking a little bit about how photography tried to argue its way into the realm of arts. Now, you'll remember from previous lectures that one of the arguments that was out there was that photography was true to the world, right? It was an exact copy of the world as it existed in front of the camera, which was just a kind of dumb machine that could capture it. And therefore, there wasn't really a way, many argued, for photography to think of itself as an art form, since there was no room for the artist to get involved. And we're going to talk a bit more today about, on the one hand, the specifics of that argument, and on the other hand, more forcefully, how many photographers tried to argue that photography was much more than using a dumb machine to reproduce the world as it existed in front of the photographic, the photographer and the camera itself. For me, this is where the story of photography starts to get pretty interesting. Up until this point, many of you have probably thought, wow, this class is pretty dry. We're just talking about, the invention of photography, the various technological innovations, the way that the look of various technological innovations lent itself to various subjects and various uses of the camera. But now we're going to be talking about how photography started to conceive of itself as an art and what the photographers did in order to create art through photography. After all, we know today, of course, you can go to galleries all over the world and find what we consider to be art photography, but it was a pretty big argument to make at this point in time. So the photograph that you see up on the screen is one in which Jonicott is trying to argue that there is a kind of correlation between the photographer and the painter. In fact, many of the early practitioners of what was known as pictorialism were initially either painters or engravers or worked as professional artists before they began to adapt their trade to the use of photography. So I'd like to start this story by reminding us that in 1851 there was a huge exhibition at the Crystal Palace in London. This is a time when photography is first allowed into the exhibition halls, although it's given a separate place from the arts themselves. And initially there was a great resistance to allowing photography in at all, which led to, for instance, the French photographer Nadar, who was, a photographer in his own right. We don't look at him in this short history of photography, but he was an important photographer in the middle of the 19th century. Many people know Nadar better in that he helped the Impressionist painters to exhibit their work by lending them an exhibition space in the initial Impressionist exhibitions, but he was also a vocal advocate for the elevation of painting into the high arts. And so when initially at the Crystal Palace exhibition in 1851 they wouldn't allow photography in, he created this little caricature or cartoon called The Ingratitude of Painting, refusing the smallest place in an exhibition to photography. And then when that decision was changed a bit, he followed it up with this cartoon, painting offering photography a place in exhibition of fine art. In any case, and by the way, here's another one. This is actually created by the famous lithographer and painter who was kind of poking fun at the idea of photography being elevated to a high art. This is Honoré Daumier's work called Nadar, Elevating Photography to a Fine Art, but he's kind of tongue-in-cheek here. Down below you see, of course, numerous little photography centers, and up above in a hot air balloon, Nadar supposedly elevating it, but it's so literal, it's supposed to be poking fun at that idea. In any case, in 1851 as well, the popularity of photography soared, and I made mention of this last lecture, when Queen Victoria and Prince Albert really loved photography at this exhibition, had their photograph taken, had many of those cartes de visite produced of themselves, and helped champion the idea of the popularity, at least, if not the artistic quality of photography. Right around this same time, within about 10 years or so, more and more vocal advocates for the elevation of photography to a fine art began to be heard. These can be both photographers as well as scholars, and one of the earliest was Beaumont Newell, who in the introduction of a kind of seminal book, one of the first on the history of photography, literally called The History of Photography, began with a quote that said, quote, "Hitherto photography has been principally content with representing truth," right? The accurate representation of the world out there. "Can its sphere," he wondered, "not be enlarged? And may it not aspire to delineate beauty too?" Well, most people didn't agree with this. For instance, Charles Baudelaire, who you've read now to remind us, wrote a scathing review warning of an industry-crazed society with, quote, "thousands of eager eyes glued to the holes of the stereoscope as if gazing through the skylight to infinity," end quote. And then he further stated, and this was his big argument, quote, "If photography is allowed to stand for art in some of its functions, it will soon supplant or corrupt it completely, thanks to the natural support it will find in the stupidity of the multitude. It must return to its real task, which is to be the servant of the sciences and of the arts, but the very humble servant, like printing and shorthand, which can have neither created nor supplanted literature." Now, one of the big moments here, and again, this doesn't convince everyone, but it does give legal status to photography as an art form, happened when there was this famous lawsuit that was brought by a couple of photographers, a photography team, Meyer and Pearson, against another photographic team, Betbetter and Schwab, of pirating their prints and using them as if they were their own. Now, Meyer and Pearson took the other photographic duo to court in a famous court case now known as the Meyer-Pearson case in 1862. See, the thing was that copyright laws only protected artistic forms, and so an argument had to be made in order to extend copyright protection to photography, that photography was a fine art in itself. And so Meyer and Pearson claimed that their photograph was protected under these copyright laws of France, and their lawyers argued, quote, when asked, "Why is this an art?" they said, quote, "What then is art? Who will define it? Who will say where it begins and where it ends? Who will say you may go just so far and no further?" I put these questions to philosophers who have dealt with them, and we can read with interest what they have written about its different forms. Art, they say, is beauty, and beauty is truth in its material reality. If we see truth in photography, and if truth in its outward form charms the eye, how can it then fail to be beauty? And if all of the characteristics of art are found there, how can it fail to be art? Well, I protest in the name of philosophy, so they went. Now again, reminding us, it was believed that the painter observes, and then through his imagination or some kind of conceptualization, conceives, and then hence after this kind of pre-thinking their way through what they're going to create, will create. The painter was thought to be, as all artists were, in contact kind of with the spirit of the subject that they were dealing with, something that was immaterial and elusive and transitive and had to be fixed in the form of painting or sculpture or literature. But this ideal world, so it was argued, was closed to the photographer, who cannot imagine but only copy the world outside of themselves. Now, the lawyers for the photographers, in this Meyer-Pearson case, then went on to argue, as you've heard a little bit here, that no, a photographer, just like a painter, preconceives of an idea, and certain photography can be considered to be art. In the first ruling in this case, photography was found not to be an art, and the argument that was given was, quote, was a manual operation which required skill and experience, but had nothing in common with the work of an artist who creates the work from nature by means of his senses and his imagination, really art. And they found no. Now, this was appealed, and it went to the appeal court, and eventually the photographer's argument held sway. People, frankly, decided they couldn't determine with exactitude what art was anyway. Why draw this limitation on something that obviously had, by the way, a fiscal end to it? A lot of money could be made here. And so they extended the artistic status or art status to photography and gave it copyright protection, which then led to, by the way, a huge group of artists raising up their voices and saying, wait a minute, this is completely not correct. They created a petition, and these are major French artists of the day, people like Eugène Delacroix, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ang, and many, many others, who together petitioned the court and sent in this petition to try to get the status of photography again changed back to a non-art, where they said, quote, whereas in recent proceedings the court was obliged to deal with the question of whether photography should be counted as a fine art and its products given the same protection as works of artists, and whereas photography consists of a series of completely manual operations which no doubt require some skill in the manipulation involved, but never resulting in works which could in any circumstances ever be compared with those works which are the fruits of intelligence and the study of art. On these grounds, the undersigned artists protest against any comparison which might be made between photography and art. But later in that year of 1862, the court was not convinced by this argument and continued to uphold the idea that photography, at least for copyright purposes and as a legal status, was an art form. But there was still a lot of work to do to convince many people that photography could be considered an art, and so those are the types of photographers we're looking at today. More often than not, people poked fun at the idea of photography as an art. Here you see this famous cartoon called Talent Comes While Sleeping. In other words, that the artist isn't doing much at all. It's all the mechanism of the camera. The artist is dumb and could do this in his sleep, so to speak. Now, before we get into the photographers themselves, I wanted to spend a little bit of time here talking about some of the main traditions of painting in the 19th century, so that you get an idea of how photography made their argument. In other words, photography, in order to convince people that it was an art form, at least initially, many of these photographers tried to make their works of art look and operate like already accepted forms of art, particularly paintings. So I have up on the screen here a work by Jean-Auguste Dominique Ang called the Grande Odalisque from 1814, which is an example of what was known at the time as Orientalism, and Ang was an academic painter. Now, let's pause here for a minute. You don't need to know all of the ins and outs of 19th century cultural history to understand what's going on here in this argument. But you do need to know that there were these huge institutions devoted to the art known as the Royal Academies to the art. The big one was in France. It later became the École des Beaux-Arts, the School of the Beautiful Arts. But there was also an academy in England, and there were academies in Germany and so forth. And most of these academies, including, very importantly for our discussion today, those in France and in England, were devoted to classical arts. Classical arts and classicism is what we call a trans-historical style. It turns up many times throughout history. Most people place its impetus or its starting point in Greece, and then it shows up again in Rome. And those of you who are familiar with the Italian Renaissance, artists like Michelangelo and Raphael and Leonardo are all classical artists. And then it shows up again at the end of the 19th century in England and in, well, even earlier than that, the end of the 18th century, I should say, in England and in France. Now, classicism as an artistic style and as an aesthetic philosophy has some pretty firm rules to it. Its main rule is that you try to create beauty by way of creating idealized pictures, pictures that represent not what the world looks like, but an ideal version of it. And this means not just perfect bodies created in perfect proportionality, but also perfect compositions with clear focal points, meaning areas that you look at first, clear structuring of the image, clear tonal contrast, the use of linear 1-point and 2-point perspective to create ideal space, and on and on and on. In the 19th century, the major form of the classical arts ends up becoming the female nude, as you see here, meant to be about not, again, specifically eroticism, even though this is, in my opinion, quite an erotic picture with an erotic subject, but more about creating the perfect idealized female form, which was seen as coextensive with the idea of art. Ideal works of art created beauty, which then was beneficial to society, so it was argued. So these major institutions to the art, the Royal Academies, pushed the idea of classical aesthetics at this time, and you'll see a lot of photographers being interested in trying to create through photography classical forms of art. Photography, more often than not, was used by many of these classical artists as an aid or a support, which is of course what Baudelaire was arguing for and what Eugene Delacroix thought that photography should be used for. Eugene Delacroix was one of the signatories of that petition against elevating photography to a fine art in the Meyer-Pearson case, but he used photography in his own art. As you see here, on the left is a photograph of a woman, a nude, and on the right is him turning that photograph into an Odalisque figure, a painting figure. Now, what is different about these for the artist? Well, the main one is that the work on the left, according to someone like Delacroix, is an accurate transcription of the world outside of itself and doesn't allow for the artist and the artist's imagination and creativity and originality and sensibility, all of the kind of components of the individual artist to be involved, whereas painting can preconceive ideas, think them out, create allegories, create, beauty through this intellectualization of the experience of the world in front of you. So moving forward, in the middle of the 19th century, there were a number of artistic movements that occurred that moved away from classical aesthetics. One of them that we'll pick up a little bit later is known as naturalism. Naturalism is a type of painting style that focused on the natural world. Lots of landscape painters by, for instance, the Barbizon school painters in France. Things things that are kind of nature, but nature that is made to look quite idyllic, or what they called at the time picturesque. Picturesque is a big term at this time. It's making the natural world beautiful. Naturalism also depicted scenes of lower class people for the first time in the 19th century, or I shouldn't say the first time, but predominantly in the 19th century, in order to draw attention at some level to rural traditions that were passing. Another artistic movement, which you're looking at here, was what was known as realism. This is the work of Gustave Courbet called The Studio of the Artist from 1855. Now, realism took as its task an accurate representation of the real world, but the trick here is in what they meant by accurate. What Courbet thought is, and what he's showing you is he's representing a landscape. This is actually a portrait of, self-portrait of Courbet in the center here, right? So he is at work painting in his studio a landscape painting, which is, on the one hand, an accurate representation of a landscape, but it has been filtered through the artist's consciousness. The artist is making decisions, painting it in a way that's supposed to evoke the spirit of the natural world, rather than just being an accurate transcription of that world around them. Now, there's a lot of other things going on here, but the big thing that I want to point out in this painting is that the female nude that you see in here, unlike the work you just saw by Jean-Auguste Dominique Ang, is a very accurate representation of a woman, and it has not been idealized. It hasn't been made perfect. It's supposed to look more real. And he used a photograph to help him to paint this picture of that nude woman. Once again, Courbet thought that photography should be a support to the arts, but not an art in its own right. So here you see the initial photograph, and Courbet making some minor alterations to that, but keeping it looking more realistic, less idealistic than the classical tradition itself. The other big thing that I want you to be aware of, because it's in the background of painting, and I brought it up in the last lecture, is the rise of modernism. Modernism is a historical moment. It's not just a style that shows up in art. And as I said in the last lecture, one of the things that marks modernism off from other periods is that modernism, rather than adopting ideas, and in the case of art, styles and conventions from early art forms without really thinking about why you're adopting those, started to think very carefully about the past very critically. In other words, they would look back at classical traditions, these modernists, and they would say which parts of these classical traditions are important in the current age, in our 19th century world. And if ideas or conventions or approaches to making art were not conceived to be important or relevant to the contemporary world, you didn't then adopt those. So a modernist would look back at the classical tradition of someone like Michelangelo and Leonardo and Raphael and many other classical artists and say, those artists were phenomenal. These are wonderful works of art, but it doesn't make any sense in my 19th century world to just adopt wholesale the works of artists from a totally different age. I should only adopt ideas that are relevant to my contemporary world. So you might see little quotations, as you do here in Edouard Manet's Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, or Luncheon on the Grass from 1863, of earlier classical artists, but there are some big changes. The first being that while we have a female nude in this picture, she's not some kind of allegory of something else. She's an actual nude in the picture. The men that are in this picture are not dressed in old togas or also nude. They are contemporary figures set in a contemporary setting. The other big thing about modernism, and this is perhaps most important to our story, is that, and again, this extends to all different realms of human activity for modernists, not just the cultural realm, not just the arts, but we're going to focus on the arts. These modernists started to ask the question, what is intrinsic and important about my particular medium? A medium is something like painting, what a work is made out of. or photography, or architecture, or sculpture. And so for the painters, as I said in the last lecture, one of the things that they started to think about is that what is the essence of painting? And one of the arguments they made is that before it is anything else, a painting is a two-dimensional field, in other words, the canvas or a board that you're painting on, that is covered by pigment. That is what it is at its basis. And if it wants to be a stronger art form, it has to draw from that essential nature of painting. And so while you probably can't see it very well here, this painting is quite flat. It looks two-dimensional. If you were to get up close on various areas of this painting, you would see the brushwork. They're just big, broad areas of paint applied to the canvas, because this artist wanted to show you that this is paint on a canvas. And if you're wondering, well, why would you want to do that? Well, if you've ever looked at, let's say, an Impressionist painting, and that's coming up next, and from afar it looks like an accurate, rendering of a natural scene, and then you get up close and you see all these little touches or brush strokes of paint that are these beautiful colors and textures. That paint itself on the surface of a canvas has its own aesthetic. It's quite materially beautiful, right? It's provocative just for being the application of paint to a canvas. And as painters went on, they came up with other rationales for why a painting should draw attention to its formal elements. Formal elements is the basic building blocks of any art form. Things such as color and line and shape and composition and the rendering of space, whereas subject matter is what that painting represents. In this case, a landscape, a still life or picnic in the foreground, a nude figure, and figures in conversation. So why is this important? Because a lot of photographers eventually, not right away, but eventually will start to think in modernist terms. The big one in our story today will be Emerson. Peter Henry Emerson, unlike people like Oscar Raylander or Henry Peach Robinson, who are more classical, was interested in what eventually will become known as straight photography, thinking about a photograph's essence. What is photography before it's anything else? What are its essences, its basic building blocks? And for a modernist or an erstwhile modernist such as Peter Henry Emerson, you didn't want to copy a painting or copy classical traditions using composite prints and so forth. That was mimicking other art forms, which were mimicking earlier art forms that, their day had passed. So modernism is in the background of this whole thing as well. So I made mention of naturalism in the Barbizon school. This was a very popular style during the 19th century, particularly in the late 1830s all the way through the end of the century. The Barbizon school is a term applied to painters who went to the forest of Fontainebleau. We saw a couple of examples of this last lecture, and painted these very Arcadian, very picturesque scenes of the natural landscape meant to evoke a mood. If you haven't heard the term Arcadian before, it's like a utopian scene, a scene that's supposed to comfort you, to make you feel like you're in the cradle of nature and everything's kind of, in this case, frolicking nymphs in nature, that's meant to give you a little bit of an escape from your industrialized world. You can see that the stylistics of this, the very kind of gauzy forms, everything that's rendered in soft focus, are supposed to be mood-inducing. They're supposed to capture the spirit of nature, not a likeness of what everything absolutely looks like. And that will become something that photographers seek to emulate. Then you also have, of course, starting in the 1870s, the rise of Impressionism, particularly in France, but it catches on in many different areas, in which these painters are trying to capture an accurate representation of what that fleeting moment of light on the landscape or in the industrial world looks like. They're not trying to capture how the mind conceives of nature per se, right? They're not trying to create a classical work of art that will tell you, in this case you're looking at a Claude Monet work called Impression Sunrise that gave the term Impressionism, its starting point. They're not trying to capture the way that a boat looks like on the water or tell you exactly what the factories in the background looks like. What they're trying to do is say, if you look at nature very quickly and you just try to capture that image on the retina with dancing, flickering changes in light and atmosphere, this is what it looks like, at least in a painting. And we'll see a couple of painters try to be a couple of photographers try to be impressionistic in their own way, thinking that if a camera is like the retina and it can capture the way that the world looks to the retina, how can I emulate that image of the retina in a photograph? If you move over to England, however, there are a lot of other things going on. One of the big movements in the middle of the century that turned away from classical aesthetics was the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. These were a bunch of young artists who had been schooled in the traditions of the Academy, such as this painter, Jean Everett Millais. The work is called The Christ in the House of His Parents from 1850, who turned away from classical aesthetics and the idea of accurate representation, I shouldn't say accurate, I should say idealistic representations of biblical scenes and old classical subject to represent much more naturalistic or very almost realistic renderings of nature. And what I mean by that is this work is about Christ, and it's got big allegories and symbolism in it about his eventual crucifixion. Christ, by the way, is in the center here. He's cut his hand, which is a symbol of the stigmata, the eventual wounds that'll get in his hand and his feet when he is crucified, and his mother Mary is offering him some comfort here, while other figures surround them. Now, up to this point, if you're a classical artist, everyone in this picture would have been idealized. They would have been made very beautiful. But what Millais tried to do here is represent it more naturalistically, as people really look. In fact, he even went so far, you see the hands on Joseph the carpenter, if you follow my cursor over here. Those hands and forearms are painted from an actual woodworker. He went down to the Carpenters Guild and got a woodworker to model those hands and arms so he could get it as accurate as possible. Now, on the one hand, this would seem to lend some credence to the idea of realism in painting, right? And that photography that captures very realistically what you set that camera in front of could have an to become an art form. But remember, then, for a painter, they compose this scene, they add symbolism, they add allegories. There's a lot more going on, supposedly, for a painter than what happens for a photographer. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood also created many scenes of, frankly, beautiful women filled with allegories, such as this one by Dante Gabriel Rossetti called Beata, Beatrix. This is a kind of memorial picture to his dead lover, Elizabeth Siddal, who had died of a laudanum overdose. And he's pictured her as if she's Beatrix, who is, of course, one of the muse figures for Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy. And just look at the kind of stylistics here. It's a very soft focus looking painting. It feels very moody. You know, some things are in more accurate detail, other things aren't. It's meant to evoke ideas rather than be an accurate likeness of a woman, and we'll see a lot of photographers try to do this in photography. Here's another one by Rossetti called Proserpine, or we would call her Persephone, based upon a Greek myth, where he used photography. This is Jane Burden Morris, who was a lover of Rossetti and, frankly, the wife of one of Rossetti's best friends, here posing in a photograph that then could be turned into a painting by Rossetti. So our first major photographer for today is Oscar Rejlander. Now, Oscar Rejlander was born in Sweden. He studied painting in Rome. He was a portraitist, a lithographer, and a copyist. And he learned photography in 1853, initially as a way to make studies for his paintings. He is best known for combination printing, and he had a huge effect on Henry Peach Robinson, who you read in that long essay on combination printing. So he had a big factory to painting, and he created these elaborate photographs based upon creating separate negatives in the collodion process, so primarily the wet plate process, and then combining these different negatives and sometimes it's up to as many as 30 or 31, as we'll see in one of the first photographs you'll see of his, to create these elaborate allegories that mimicked the styles of painting. He was supported by artists such as Gustave Dore. You see a portrait here by Raylander of Gustave Dore, who was an engraver and a literary figure and a painter as well in his aspirations. He created works of art, as I said before, photographs that initially were meant to serve his own needs as a painter, but then very quickly he began to turn these into what he conceived to be works of art themselves. This is his study of female nudes for the work that we're going to be spending the most time on, The Two Ways of Life, in a moment here. So he would pose figures in a studio, women, in this case a figure of shame with a veil over her head. This is a long, age-old symbolism in painting. And then photograph them, and then take these individual photographs, mask them off, and recombine the printing. It's a very elaborate process, as you will have read about, to create these composite prints that were, compared to most of the art that you've seen, big. So for instance, Two Ways of Life is about 16 by 30 inches, a very big picture. Most, of course, photographs were about the same size as the photographic negative, which is a very standard small size here. So in Two Ways of Life, let me just toggle forward here, we've got this composite print, 31 different negatives combined, masked off, and then reprinted to create this large-scale picture. Now the picture itself is based upon classical works of art. So I'll bring in one example. This is Raphael Sanzio's famous School of Athens in the Vatican in Rome in the Stanza della Signatura, which is one of the fresco paintings that shows all of the classical philosophers basically teaching about the arts and sciences and philosophy all together. And you'll notice that the compositional format is really clear here, right? We have these concentric archways that lead you into what's called a focal point, an area of focus that our eye is turned to. You can probably see, if you follow these lines of the architecture, that all of these lines recede. They're all painted in linear one-point perspective to that focal point, pointing us towards that. And then everything is very organized in this picture. It's not the way that an actual scene would look, so that you've got a clear kind of middle ground and a background and a foreground here. Linkages between the different figures. It's very symmetrical and balanced, and these are all classical aesthetic qualities. If we now return to Two Ways of Life, we see a photograph that follows those same stylistics. This is Raylander creating a photograph that mimics how paintings looked in the classical tradition. In the center is an old man. He is a sage. He's, a symbol of wisdom. And this whole work is a big allegory about two ways of life. The good way, which is on the right-hand side of this picture, and the bad way, which is on the left-hand side of the picture. On the left-hand side of the picture, you see a young man that is running out into the world, and he's going to follow these vices of lust, so women in nudity all over the place, and gambling over here, and idleness over here, people not doing anything. He's going the wrong way, in other words. Where over here, on the other side, you see a man who's, let's say, walking into the world much more sedately and slowly and conscientiously, and he is going to follow the good way of life. of religion. So over here you see a symbol of a woman reading a Bible, of good works over here, people being industrious and putting themselves to hard work, and a symbol of marriage as well here. So he's following the right way of life. Now what I want to say about this is, beyond just copying the aesthetics of the classical tradition with a clear focal point right in the middle of the scene, framed by the archway here, with a clear kind of balancing or symmetry of the figures. There's equal weight on both sides of the central axis of this, of a clear kind of separation of all these figures from one another to give you an easy way to look at them. A clear foreground and a background here. The theatricality of a curtain up above. These are all hallmarks of the classical tradition. The use of female nudes in here, which were part of the classical tradition as well. This work is also about meaning. It's about an allegory. It's about teaching. And these are all things that painting had always done in the classical tradition. So the artist is basically trying to adapt photography to traditions in painting. And this became known as pictorialism. Pictorialism then was basically the way that someone noted that a photograph was a form of art rather than just a transcription of reality here. Now, when he exhibited this work, it met with a great deal of controversy on a number of grounds. One of the first grounds was that this was not being true to photographs. Photographs are supposed to picture the world as it really exists. And so he was breaking that rule. Number two, people were upset about the nudity in this work. And this is something to wrap your mind around. Nudes have been part of the classical tradition going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, and of course they're part of the tradition of the Renaissance and a huge part of the tradition of the 19th century. So you see paintings of nude women all over the place. But what you don't see a lot of, and what was basically illegal, are photographs of nude women, because it was too real. It looked, and it was, of course, a real woman's body, and this brought up the question of whether this was moral or not to look at nude women when it was a real woman you were looking at. So think of that. When it was exhibited, sometimes they would cover up the nudes in this picture, especially the bad side, so that people wouldn't get the wrong idea, and instead of being taught not to follow lust and gambling and idleness, they might be, let's say, provoked to follow that path. In any case, later on, people like Emerson would point to works like this and say, this is everything that's wrong with photography. This is, these composite prints, the copying of the painting traditions. These are not what a modernist photographer should be up to. If you want to do things like this, go be a painter. Photography should be doing something else. So a couple more works, a little bit less time spent on these, by Oscar Raylander. This is a work that's, again, all of these are composite prints, called The Head of St. John the Baptist. Taken a photograph of a man and a photograph of some kind of container and composite printed these things so as to evoke the idea of a beheaded John. Composite prints can be used to be pretty creative, I think. This is Raylander in a composite print. On the right-hand side, he's showing himself as an artist, and then on the left-hand side, he's showing himself as a volunteer for the army here. So kind of dual self-portrait of himself. He also created works. He got very interested in the question of human emotions. There are many writings out there trying to document the actual expressions that people had when they had a particular emotion. And in this work called Hard Times, we see an example of that, where he's showing people who are, in very difficult situations. You actually see a composite print of a woman's face here, amidst the face of the man looking off into the distance. And it's probably his memory of the loss of his wife, who you see in the bed behind him. This is part of that spiritualist tradition in a way too. But he's really trying to document the way that a human expression looks and compare it to, this interior state of a human being. He also, in these very experimental works, kind of gives you a little foreshadowing of the way that surrealism will use photography. In this case, he's trying to conceptualize an interior state, the bachelor's dream here of a man sleeping on the chaise longue, and then these soft focus images of, who knows what this is supposed to be, figures kind of acrobatically running across this stanchion in the left-hand side. So I'm going to pause here for a minute, right back, hopefully minimal. So if we now turn to the work of Henry Peach Robinson, who you have read an excerpt of, and I want to say that the excerpt that you read comes from what became almost like a Bible for photographers who were seeking to elevate painting to a high art. And of course, he's going into combination printing in particular. What Robinson, first of all, he was very deeply influenced by Oscar Raylander's work to start with, and tried to adapt those ideas into his own art. What Robinson basically argued at the beginning of that essay that I gave you was that the same laws that govern all of the arts, including painting, govern photographers as well. And though he does acknowledge that there are certain realms of the imagination that a photographer can't get into in the same way that a painter can, that there was poetry still to be had in photography itself. He wrote many different treatises beyond the pictorial effect in photography, which you read. He was the major theorist of the time, over 11 major publications, and basically was about adopting painting strategies to photography, uniting, as he said, the rational, meaning the photographic mechanism, with the subjective, or the artist's impression of a scene, which he called the picturesque, and which became a component of pictorialism, this style that we're looking at this moment in time. So what did his works look like? He was also interested in composite printing and in staged photographs. So early on, he's doing things like this, Little Red Riding Hood, Finding a Wolf in Grandmother's Bed, a composite print of a famous fairy tale. And scenes like this, women and children in the country, this is meant to evoke the idea of women being closer to the natural world and being kind of the moral side of humanity. He got famous for works of art that mimicked the types of paintings that you would see in the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. The Lady of Shalott here is a composite print of a woman in a boat in a naturalistic scene. It comes from the famous mythology of the stories of King Arthur. The Lady of Shalott is one of the key figures in that story. And of course, this looks suspiciously like this famous painting by John Everett Millais, who you saw earlier, called Ophelia. So he's, again, just like Raylander, using photography to mimic what he called immutable laws of art that you can find in painting. And so his works of art, again, are filled with allegories. They're filled with allusions to literary figures. They're filled with symbolism. This work, which is called Dawn and Sunset, is on an age-old theme that you would find in paintings and art of all kind on the stages of life. A young infant with her mother on the left-hand side and an old man off to the right. You can see that the work is very carefully composed, right, with a clear focal point in the center of a fire, the fire of life being partially extinguished, and balanced on each side of these, youth and old age here. He got particularly famous with scenes that were meant to be allegories of various things, such as sleep here, a dream state, or this one in particular that we'll pause and spend a little bit more time on, called Fading Away from 1858. In this work, which is a combination print, we see a woman who is dying, and she's surrounded by her family, looking forlornly on this scene. It's got a man at the window looking out as if he can't bear to see this woman in the last stages of her life. And it's all about death and mourning. It's got a very standard classical composition with a kind of pyramidal, meaning a big triangular composition in the middle here, giving the work balance, with the man framed in the scene looking out into the very kind of moody sky. On each side, balanced on each side, the figures, and then everyone looking at the woman who is dying. This is what we call implied lines. When something looks at something else, or a shape in a picture points towards something, it helps to focus us on that figure or on that object that is being pointed to. They're not actual lines. We call them implied lines, in the same way that if I point to something, your eye is going to follow where my pointing gesture goes in an implied line towards that object. Now, when he created this work, it was massively controversial, and it's controversial in an odd way. The controversy had to do with the realism that was thought of being invoked by this work, real death rather than painted death. People actually worried that he had used an actual dead body in this, which of course he didn't. You can just have a woman with her eyes closed, pretending to be dead, but the evocation of real death was something that was concerning to a lot of people. Some of that controversy went away when this work was purchased by Prince Albert, which lended it a certain degree of support. Just kind of separately within the same tradition in England, some of you know, of course, of Lewis Carroll and his famous stories about Alice in Wonderland and so forth. He was a photographer as well, who is a little bit of a controversial figure too, since the subjects of most of his photographs were scenes of young women, sometimes moderately eroticized, where what he seems to have been trying to get at is youthful beauty, and innocence in photography. And I just wanted to show you some of these scenes. Alice and the Dormouse here. Alice is a little beggar girl, kind of innocence and youth and budding sexuality. A lot of his nieces and women in his town were the subjects of his paintings. So a sleeping Alexandra Kitchin here. And his most famous subject, Irene MacDonald, and these are the kinds of works that got him into a little bit of trouble. Sometimes Irene MacDonald was pictured in various states of nudity, and one wondered about, let's say, the propriety of leaving your daughter alone with someone like Lewis Carroll. We don't really know what was up with him. This is a picture, a photograph of Julia Margaret Cameron by the artist Lewis Carroll, and I just wanted to show you this so that we can kind of segue into looking at some of Julia Margaret Cameron's work. A lot of these artists became and started various what were called amateur photography groups. For instance, Oscar Raylander was a major member of the British Exchange Club. Now, amateur is a good thing when it comes to art photography. These aren't people who are out to make money off of their work. Those were known as the professional photographers. So these amateur photographic clubs were things that people belonged to push the idea of art photography. Henry Peach Robinson was one of the co-founders of one of the most famous of these art clubs, known as the Linked Ring. And Julia Margaret Cameron who was a very privileged, rich Brit who lived in India for a while and taught herself the collodion process when she returned, was someone who helped to promote these artistic clubs. Julia Margaret Cameron, as she once said, was interested, quote, in making photography a fine art, as she said, by, quote, "My aspirations are to ennoble photography and to secure for it the character and the uses of high art by combining the real and the ideal and sacrificing nothing to truth by all possible devotion to poetry and beauty." You see that, of course, she had the support of people like Sir John Herschel, who we met in the first lectures, this kind of behind-the-scenes physicist, astronomer, scientist, chemist who helped to develop the various technologies of photography. A couple of these things. The poetry in her work, as she thought, came from the posing of these figures, from the lighting of these figures, from that kind of selective focus that will give you a fairly strong focus on the face, but blur the hair out and blur the background out. She was friends with all the major figures of her day, such as Charles Darwin. Most of her photographs, though, are of her friends and family, where she makes these pictures of beautiful women in soft focus, selective lighting, and so forth, so as to evoke a mood or a kind of feeling about these figures. This is her study for Ophelia from 1867. They look quite a bit like Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood depictions of beautiful women at this time, and that correlation between these paintings that were being, very critically acclaimed and photography was something that was meant to lend photography the status of a high art form. So another one of these, Kate Kyun as Beatrix. Remember, Beatrix shows up in Dante Gabriel Rossetti's work. Or the echo here, another kind of beautiful woman staring back at us, and that idea of photography being an echo of the real world or an echo of the artist, in this case the photographer artist, feeling about the real world. She also created Pre-Raphaelite studies. These are basically direct copies of, in photographic form, of types of paintings that were being produced. An example here being Dante Gabriel Rossetti's Lady Lilith. If you go back and forth between these, you can see the obvious correlation between these two things. She worked in large plates in the collodion process, up to 11 by 14-inch plates. She played around with different lenses, different size lenses, to get these qualities of her paintings. She eventually messed around with composite printing, such as in this work's Cupid's Pencil of Light. Remember, the pencil of light is an idea that was brought up first by Talbot, the idea that he called it the pencil of nature, right? That cameras were the pencil of nature. And here you see Cupid, a symbol of love and beauty, in front of a mirror, representing this idea that photography is its own type of art form that is, created in part by the artist's own sensibility, in part by the photographic mechanism capturing the effects of light. She oftentimes, of course, created allegories based upon age-old themes in the arts, such as the idea of the muse. The muse is the symbol of, or personification of inspiration, in this case, lending inspiration to the creation of music. She depicted scenes based upon mythology, just as the painters had. This work, called The Parting of Lancelot and Queen Guinevere, from the stories of King Arthur. Scenes from, of course, some of our favorites, Romeo and Juliet. This is Friar Lawrence and Juliet. And scenes from mythology, the Angel of Nativity, or a famous allegory. You can find this in a number of different paintings a Venus chiding Cupid and depriving him of his wings, taking away Cupid's ability to strike desire through his arrows into whoever he wanted. Now, one of the major characters, of course, in this whole story, and a big turning point in photography, was Peter Henry Emerson, who you've also read. Peter Henry Emerson, as I've said earlier in this lecture, is a major proponent of what eventually becomes known as straight photography, meaning that he liked photographs that were more modernist, photographs that tried to take into account the intrinsic properties of the camera without making it, the servant or, let me go back at this. Let me say it this way. Unlike someone like Ray Lander or Henry Peach Robinson, who used photography in order to emulate painting, and painting itself, that by the way was emulating past forms of classical traditions, Peter Henry Emerson wanted photography to draw upon the intrinsic properties of the camera and its ability to capture the way that the world looked. He, for instance, developed what was known as the platinum process, which was, and patented it, which was the use of kind of a way to develop an image using ultraviolet radiation that increased the photosensitivity and created these atmospheric effects in photographs. But he didn't like photographs that manipulated photography. So no composite prints. He advocated for the use of a handheld camera. No kind of manipulation of the image in the darkroom, or at least minimal manipulation. And this insistence on a kind of straight photograph was something that in the end he ran into a little bit of problem rationalizing, and we'll get to that in a moment. One of his most famous series of works, and this is one photograph of it called The Throwing of the Cast Net, came from a series known as Life and Landscape on the Norfolk Broads. Now, this is meant to be a limited folio edition, meaning a book, a picture book of 40 prints that were meant to, on the one hand, kind of document the disappearing customs of rural folk in his time. And he would print these out. They come out in, again, this limited folio, accompanied by text from Emerson about photography and quotes from the people who he is representing. He, of course, is eventually will turn these into prints by etching process known as photogravure, which had been developed by Henry Talbot, but we'll get to that later on in our lectures. What we see here then are, these disappearing customs, someone fishing in nature. These look typically like most of his work. It's a handheld camera here, very, very kind of soft focus on these scenes, very naturalistic, meaning representing what he actually saw rather than asking people to pose for these types of scenes. As he once said, quote, "Nothing in nature has a hard outline." He was very interested in this idea that came from Hermann von Helmholtz, that the eye has a sharp focus in the center. This is the way that the eye works, and that it loses its focus on the periphery, called the theory of differential vision, or differential focus. And he thought that the camera mimicked this. So he said, quote, "Nothing in nature has a hard outline, but everything is seen against something else. And its outlines fade gently into that something else, often so subtly that you cannot quite distinguish where one ends and the other begins. In this mingled decision and indecision, this lost and found, lies all the charm and mystery of nature." So what is he saying here? He's on the one hand copying the way, or using the photograph to document the way that vision works and how something actually looks, but it's also capturing the essence of nature in the process. Now, this is more about Emerson's theory. Emerson was one of the first, by the way, to really think about the different usages of photography, which he divided into three different, what he called divisions. The pictorial division, which is what we're looking at here, the art photography. The scientific division, that was meant to be an accurate representation of the world. And the industrial division, the use of photography for industry. If we focus on the pictorial tradition or division, Emerson once said, quote, "In this division, the aim of the work is to give aesthetic pleasure alone." In other words, pleasure of beauty or pleasure of looking. And the photographer's only wish is to produce pictorial decorative works. Such work can be accordingly judged only by men of artistic instincts, and the aim and scope of such work can be fully appreciated only by trained artists. Photographers who qualify themselves by training or prove their works by their works that they have art instincts alone belong to this class. Included would be original pictorial photographers, first-rate photo etchers, and typo block makers whose aim is to reproduce in facsimile all the artistic quality of original works of art. Such photographers should have some artistic training, as all the best have always had. Now that's his division of the different kind of types of photography. But within the pictorialist division, he also talked about the way that all art has these four different possibilities to them. And this is what I have on the screen in front of you. Emerson's so-called four terms. The first term is idealist, and this is something that, of course, comes from the classical tradition of painting and sculpture. And an idealist is one who uses the imagination, i.e. combines several ideals into one harmonious whole. The idealist may transcend, go beyond known nature by using and drawing from the imagination and creativity. This is not something that a photographer could do, according to Emerson. Number two is the impressionist, who is one who renders a personal view of nature, even verging on absurdity, right? So someone who is not really about the naturalist, but a personal view of nature. Number three is a naturalist, one who renders in an impersonal method of expression a more or less correct reflection of nature, wherein one, truth of sentiment, two, illusion of truth of appearance, as far as that's possible, and three, decoration are of first and supreme importance, and this is what he's up to, the naturalist. Or four, an artist may be a realist, one who, quote, will, and as so far as he is able, photograph all the veins and leaves of a tree as they really are and not as they look as a whole, which, again, might be useful, as he would later say, to a botanist, but not particularly artistic. Now, Emerson, as I said before, throws in with a naturalist. As the naturalist's work, as he says, quote, "The naturalist's work we should call pictorially true to nature. The realist is false to nature." And by nature, he means the kind of spirit of nature, its essence, its feeling. The work of the realist will be true for botany, but not for a picture. Then he went on to argue that because of the nature of the painter's methods and materials and that of the photographer's, an artist must either be an idealist or an impressionist, meaning allowing in the personal into a creation of a work of art, and a photographer must either be a naturalist or a realist. Now, since a photographer, because of his machine, cannot be an idealist, right? He's tied to the mechanism of the camera. He also cannot be a true artist or a complete artist. This is a weird thing to have to argue, but Emerson thought the photography was not quite a true art. Quote, "Photography is not an art because a machine comes between the man's ideal and nature, and the result is, at some level, machine-made." some more of his works here. Again, from this series that we've been talking about, from the Norfolk Broads. This is a gunner working up to a fowl. It's basically a man hunting, using his boat to slowly work up to whatever animal he's trying to shoot here. And you can see that differential focus. It's kind of more blurry on the top and the bottom. You can see a selective focus in on the man in the boat to some degree, but everything looks, quite hazy and is meant to evoke the feeling of nature rather than just an accurate, perfect representation of it. This work called The Stiff Pull, a man tilling the fields. Again, while he didn't point it out, a lot of his subjects of rural folk come from the traditions of painting known as naturalism, such as this work by Francois Millet called The Angelus. See the soft focus here, rural folk tilling the fields, being very in tune with nature. That's what he's trying to get at here as well. An untitled work of someone cutting, grass in a swamp. In the barley harvest here, rural folk tilling the fields. Again, in the background of this is the naturalist tradition in painting that is then being conceived of as being something that a photographer can do as well in his own naturalist tradition. At the plow, the end of the furrow. Pulling the marsh hay. Take a look at this very carefully, right? We have a selective focus on the figure in the foreground, differential focus with the kind of cartouche of things at the edges of the photograph getting more and more blurry. It's meant to evoke the spirit of the scene rather than an actual likeness of the scene. And once again, to push this idea further, remember he's a modernist. He wants photography to be at least, in tune with and following the rules of the photographic apparatus, the camera, and minimal manipulation in the printing process. But he also wants that photograph to evoke a feeling of the natural world, have something of the sentiment or feeling that the photographer felt in front of this scene, and he gets to that by these qualities of soft focus lighting and so forth. Clay mill in Norfolk, the poacher. Now, I should say before I go on, and you'll read about this, in the end, while he kept kind of advocating for photography being an erstwhile art, and while he was the major proponent for basically straight photography, he eventually kind of recanted his views in a quite melodramatic fashion in an essay that was published as The Death of Naturalistic Photography, a renunciation. He thought in his own mind that the photographer had more control over the tonal lighting of a photograph than in the end was apparently proven by a couple of scientists. And when he read that, and in conversation with the famous painter James McNeill Whistler, who convinced him that he was confusing art with nature, he basically recanted all his views and said that photographs could never be an art form. In fact, in the short pamphlet, he said, quote, "I, saner than ever, renounce and abjure all theories, teachings, and views on art written and first promulgated by me in sundry works, articles, etc., and finally collected in a volume entitled Naturalistic Photography. I cast them upon the dust heap." Another photographer in the same vein, just to give you an idea that these aren't lone figures, was George Davidson, who in this work called The Onion Field is trying to produce a work of art that is meant to be in line with Impressionism, which he greatly admired. And in this work, again, you have something that looks very much like an Emerson work, soft selective focus, something that is a scene of nature. But for Davidson, he thought of trying to capture the way that the scene looked to his retina, and he considered the photograph to be a kind of mechanism of the human eye. Now, to give us you know, we're thinking of all this in the background, aren't we? I mean, these things look so much like naturalism and the Barbizon school of landscape painters that you can see the correlation being drawn between painting and photography. Now, as we follow this story forward a little bit, we'll spend some more time with figures like this. This is Robert Demachi, who eventually will become part of the kind of Stieglitz circle and shown a lot in his famous magazine called Camera Work. Robert Demachi developed what was known as the gum bichromate process in order to give more painterly qualities to photography. Again, you don't need to remember this, and you can read about this in greater detail in your textbook. And by not remember this, what I mean is you don't need to know the chemical processes that go into these various photographic forms, only to know the basics, the kind of general ideas here. So basically what he's doing in this work called Speed in 1904 in the gum bichromate process is you would take a photographic negative and put it on a support that was then coated with gum arabic that had a little bit of pigment in it, usually black and white pigment or various gray pigments. Sometimes you put a little bit of watercolor or tempera paint in there as well. And then you would combine this with light-sensitive material. Ammonium of potassium bichromate is one of the things that was used. And then you would submit this or expose this entire, basically think of a photographic negative that's got some kind of pigment over it. That's basic binder is this gum arabic that is photosensitized. Not so dissimilar than the very first photographs that were produced early on by Nymphs. And then you submit this or you expose this to UV radiation, and the gum arabic hardens some so that when you wash it away, there is this kind of textured quality to the photographic print that you can, I think, see here. And as he said, and by the way, he's just kind of technically brilliant, he said, quote, "A straight print may be beautiful, and it may prove superabundant that its author is artistic, but it cannot be a work of art. A work of art must be a transcription, not a copy of nature. There's not a particle of art in the most beautiful scene of nature. The art is man alone. It is a subjective, not objective thing. If a man slavishly copies nature, no matter if it is with a hand or pencil or through a photographic lens, he may be a supreme artist all the while, but that particular work of his cannot be called a work of art." And this is just another way of saying what we've been saying the whole time. Art has never been an accurate transcription of the world exclusively. It's been some type of filtering of the world or objects in the world through the artist's sensibility and thinking about what makes it artistic. And this gum bichromate process was one of the ways that Demachi tried to create art. But we'll pick this story up next time, or rather not next time, but as we go forward, watching the pictorialist tradition turn into the modernist tradition under people like Stieglitz. Another work by Demachi. Okay, until next time, I hope you've enjoyed this lecture, and I'll see you then.